Last week we discussed how this military buildup resulted in tensions in Asia and eventually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But today we will talk about the impact of Cold War in domestic front. We'll talk about the civil rights movement and various other changes that were taking place in the United States. We'll start with the anxiety regarding the teenagers. Teenagers first emerged as a cultural and economic force in the 1950s. In a departure from the past, most stayed in school rather than joining the adult workforce, believing that a high school education was an important stepping stone to prosperity. High school provided an environment separate from the worlds of children and adults. At the same time, teens' income rose dramatically. Many benefited from the growing service sector, which provided millions of after-school jobs such as serving as car hops at drive-in restaurants. For the first time, suburban parents gave their children generous allowances. By 1959, the average teen's combined income was $10 a week, and their collective purchasing power amounted to an astounding $10 billion annually. Unlike in previous eras, teens got to keep and to spend their earnings. Manufacturers and the culture industries were acutely aware of the profit to be made by shaping and tapping into teens' tastes. Movies, clothes, and radio programs designed specially with the teenager in mind flooded the market. Teen and a dozen of other teen-oriented magazines stressed the importance of physical appearance and popularity, both of which could supposedly be attained by purchasing the right clothing, personal products, and records. Parents, teachers, police, and other adults widely disapproved of these activities and were generally anxious about teens' increased autonomy. Youth's insistence on having separate activities challenged the dominant 1950s ideal of family togetherness. Parents' fear were further fueled by an outpouring of alarmist books and Hollywood movies portraying teens as morally lost, sexually confused, and prone to violence. Another cultural development that created anxiety among the society members was the development of rock and roll and its extreme popularity among the teenagers. The growing popularity of rock and roll was partly due to the fact that white teens were already pushing the boundaries of acceptable sexuality and looking for new ways to express themselves. In live performances, the new technologies of electric guitar enable 4 and 5-person bands to create heart-thumping walls of sound previously possible only with orchestras of 30 or 40 musicians. The arrival of new affordable record players both suited rock and roll songs and teens' budget. For some white teenagers, rock and roll's black roots also gave it an appealing, rebellious quality. Soon, big record labels became interested in smaller labels' most successful artists, including a working-class 20-year-old from Mississippi named Elvis Presley. Presley's sound, looks, and famously physical performance style, all of which drew directly on black performance, made him a smash hit among teen audiences. Not everyone liked Elvis Presley, however. Catholic Cardinal Francis Spellman, Archbishop of New York, claimed that Presley's 1955 performance on The Ed Sullivan Show was proof that teenagers were in thrall of a new creed of dishonesty, violence, lust, and degradation. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned that rock and roll plunges men's mind into degrading and immoral depths. Pressure mounted on the federal government to investigate rock and roll, leading Senators John F. Kennedy and Barry Goldwater to press for legislation against the way record companies paid disc jockeys to promote the latest songs on the airwaves. This practice, known as payola, had been common for years, and efforts to stop it masked a deeper impulse to censor rock and roll. Houston, Boston, Baltimore, Atlanta, and a dozen of other cities prohibited live concerts, and in 1959 a House of Subcommittee declared its intention to save America from rock and roll. In response, TV and some of the larger record companies tried to make rock and roll more respectable and family-friendly. Most celebrity rebels were quite easily tamed, especially where lucrative contracts were at stake. Elvis Presley's publicists emphasized the performer's church-going childhood and strong family ties. And once he returned from military service, he abandoned his distinctive rockabilly hairstyle and provocative dance moves. Now we will move on to the civil rights movement. In 1954, despite social critics' bleak assessment of contemporary culture, many black Americans were cautiously optimistic that meaningful social change was near at hand. That year, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. As the United States tried to recruit support for the Cold War in the Third World, the federal government began advising federal courts that Legalized segregation was damaging the country's reputation overseas. Pointing to the contradiction between Cold War rhetoric and segregationist reality, the small but growing Black freedom movement mobilized to force desegregation non-violently. These efforts were the cornerstone of what would become the first mass-supported Black freedom movement since the Reconstruction. While the Cold War had produced a tense stalemate, by the mid-1950s, race relations in the United States threatened to explode the domestic tranquility, masking years of injustice. Eisenhower entered office committed to civil rights in principle, and he pushed the issue in areas of federal authority. During his first 3 years, public facilities in Washington, D.C. were desegregated. Beyond that, two aspects of President's philosophy limited progress in civil rights: his preference for state or local action over federal involvement, and his doubt that laws could change racial attitudes. In the mid-1930s, the NAACP had resolved to test the separate but equal doctrine that had upheld racial segregation since the Plessy decision in 1896. Here I am talking about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that provided legal justification for segregation on trains and buses in public facilities such as hotels, theaters, and schools. Eventually, NAACP decided to begin their efforts to integrate society by focusing on higher education. But it took almost 15 years to convince the courts that segregation must end. By early 1950s, challenges to state laws mandating segregation in public schools were rising through the appellate courts. 5 such cases from Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, usually cited by reference to the first Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, came to the Supreme Court for joint argument by NAACP attorneys in 1952. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion handed down on May 17, 1954, in which a unanimous court declared that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. In support of its opinion, the court cited sociological and psychological findings demonstrating that even if separate facilities were equal in quality, the mere fact of separating students by race engendered feelings of inferiority. A year later, after further argument, the court directed that the process of racial integration should move with all deliberate speed. Eisenhower refused to force states to comply with the court's decisions. Privately, he maintained that Supreme Court decisions set back progress in the South at least 15 years. While token integration began as early as 1954 in the border states of Kentucky and Missouri, hostility mounted in the Deep South and Virginia, led by newly formed Citizens Council. The Citizens Council were middle and upper class version of the KKK that spread quickly across the region and eventually enrolled 250,000 members. Instead of physical violence, the council used economic coercion against blacks who crossed racial boundaries. African Americans who defied white supremacy would lose their jobs, have their insurance policies cancelled, or be denied personal loans or home mortgages. The Citizens Council grew so powerful in many communities that membership became almost a prerequisite for an aspiring white politician. The essential role played by the NAACP and the courts in providing a legal lever for the civil rights movement often overshadows the courageous contributions of individual African Americans who took great personal risks to challenge segregation. In Montgomery, Alabama, for example, on December 1, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks, a black seamstress who was an officer in the local NAACP chapter, boldly refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man. She was tired of giving in to the system of white racism. When the bus driver told Parks he would have her arrested, she replied, "You may do that." Police thereupon arrested her, an event that changed the course of history. And because of this incident, Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the most important activists of the civil rights movement. We'll discuss that now. Born in Atlanta, the grandson of a slave and a son of a minister, King was endowed with intelligence, courage, and eloquence. After graduating from Morehouse College in Atlanta, he attended Divinity School, earned a doctorate in philosophy from Boston University, and accepted to call to preach in Montgomery. He inspired the civil rights movement with a compelling plea for nonviolence disobedience based upon the Gospels, the writings of Henry David Thoreau, and the example of Mahatma Gandhi in India. The Montgomery bus boycott achieved a remarkable solidarity. For 381 days, African Americans used carpools or simply walked. But the white civic leaders held out against the boycott and against the pleas of a bus company tired of losing money. The boycotters' family won a federal case they had initiated against bus segregation, and in 1956, the Supreme Court affirmed that the separate but equal doctrine can no longer be safely followed as a correct statement of the law. The next day, King and other African Americans boarded the buses. To keep alive the spirit of the boycott and spread the civil rights movement beyond Alabama, King and a group of associates in 1957 organized the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Several days later, King found an unexploded dynamite bomb on his front porch. 2 hours afterward, he addressed his congregation. Many white Southerners were enraged by the Montgomery boycott, the Brown decision, and the subsequent efforts to disintegrate the South. In Congress, 101 lawmakers signed the Southern Manifesto denouncing the Supreme Court ruling as a clear abuse of judicial power and pressing whites to defy court-ordered integration. Over 5,000 Southerners joined White Citizens Council that had been established after the war, and even KKK revived. Its membership increased to 1920s levels. Over 500 acts of Klan-sponsored violence and thousands of other assaults increased. Recognizing the new integrationist sensibility of much of the growing teen culture, the Klan and the Citizens Council also physically attacked integrated venues and threatened to chase rock and rollers out of town. Despite President Eisenhower's reluctance to take the lead in disintegrating schools, he supported the rights of African Americans to vote. In 1956, hoping to exploit divisions between Northern and Southern Democrats and to reclaim some of the black votes for the Republicans, Eisenhower proposed legislation that became the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The first civil rights law passed since Reconstruction, it finally got through the Senate after a year's delay, with the help of Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, a Texas Democrat who won Southern acceptance by watering it down. The Civil Rights Act established the Civil Rights Commission, which was later extended indefinitely, and a new Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department which could seek injunction to prevent interference with the right to vote. Yet, by 1959, the Civil Rights Act had not added a single Southern black to the voting rolls. Neither did the Civil Rights Act of 1960, which provided for federal courts referees to register African Americans to vote in districts where a court found a pattern and practice of discrimination and made it a federal crime to interfere with any court order. A few weeks after the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed, Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus called out the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Little Rock's Central High School under a federal court order. A conference between the president and the governor proved fruitless, but on court order, Governor Faubus withdrew the National Guard. When the African American students tried to enter the school, a hysterical white mob forced local authorities to remove the students. At that point, Eisenhower, who had said 2 months before that he could not imagine any set of circumstances that would ever induce him to send federal troops, ordered 1,000 federal paratroopers to Little Rock to protect the black students, and he placed local National Guard units on federal service. The soldiers stayed through the school year. In summer of 1958, Faubus decided to close the Little Rock High School rather than allow integration, and court proceedings dragged on into 1959 before the schools could be reopened. In that year, massive resistance to integration in Virginia collapsed when both state and federal courts struck down state laws that had cut off funds to integrated schools. Thereafter, massive resistance for the most part was confined to Deep South, where 5 states from South Carolina west through Louisiana still opposed even token integration. The most important development in domestic life during the 1960s occurred in the civil rights. JFK entered the White House reluctant to challenge conservative Southern Democrats on the race issue. He was never as personally committed to the cause of civil rights as his younger brother Robert, the Attorney General. Despite a few dramatic gestures of support towards the African American leaders, President Kennedy only belatedly realized the moral and emotional significance of the most widespread reform movement of the decade. Like Franklin Roosevelt, he celebrated racial equality but did little to promote it. Eventually, his conscience was picked up by the grassroots civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. After the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56, King's philosophy of militant nonviolence inspired others to challenge the deeply entrenched patterns of racial segregation in the South. At the same time, lawsuits to desegregate the public schools got thousands of parents and young people involved. The momentum generated fast genuine mass movement in African American history when 4 black college students sat down and demanded service at a white-only Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1, 1960. Within a week, the sit-in movement had spread to 6 more towns in the state, and within 2 months, demonstrations had occurred in 54 cities in 9 states. In 1960, student activists, black and white, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which worked with King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to broaden the civil rights movement. In 1963, Martin Luther King launched a series of demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, where Police Commissioner Eugene Conner served as a perfect foil for King's tactic of nonviolent civil disobedience. Conner's police used dogs, tear gas on the protesters, while millions of outraged Americans watched the confrontations on television. King, who was arrested and jailed during the demonstration, wrote his now famous letter from Birmingham jail. In his letter, King signaled a shift in his strategy for social change. He had emphasized the need to educate Southern whites about the injustice of segregation and other patterns of discrimination. Now he focused more on gaining federal enforcement of the law and new legislation by provoking racists to display their violent hatred in public. As King admitted in his letter, he sought to organize nonviolent protests to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which had constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. The sublime courage that King and many other protesters displayed helped mobilize national support for their integrationist objective. Nudged by his brother Robert, a man of greater conviction, compassion, and vision, President Kennedy finally decided that enforcement of existing statutes was not enough. New legislation was needed to deal with the race question. In 1963, he told the nation that racial discrimination has no place in American life or law. He then endorsed an ambitious civil rights bill intended to end discrimination in public facilities, desegregate public schools, and protect African American voters. But the bill was quickly blocked in Congress by Southern conservatives, who had become increasingly resistant to social change since mobilizing to thwart Roosevelt's New Deal in the late 1930s. After Kennedy's assassination, the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had presented to Congress in 1963 became law in 1964 through Lyndon Johnson's forceful leadership. It prohibited racial segregation in public facilities such as bus terminals, restaurants, theaters, and hotels. The Civil Rights Bill passed the House in February 1964. In the Senate, however, Southern legislators launched a filibuster that lasted 2 months. Johnson finally prevailed, and the bill became law on July 2nd. But the new president knew that it had come at a political price. On the night after signing the bill, Johnson told an aide that we have just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come. Nevertheless, the civil rights movement was making progress. Early in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. organized an effort to enroll the 3 million African Americans in the South who had not registered to vote. In Selma, Alabama, civil rights protesters began a march to Montgomery, about 40 miles away, only to be violently dispersed by state troopers. A federal judge agreed to allow the march, and President Johnson provided troops for protection. By March 25, when the demonstrators reached Montgomery, some 35,000 people were with them, and King delivered a rousing address from the steps of the state capitol. The resulting Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured all citizens the right to vote. It authorized the Attorney General to dispatch federal examiners to register voters. In states or counties where fewer than half the adults had voted in 1964, the act suspended literacy tests and other devices commonly used to defraud citizens of the vote. By the end of the year, some 250,000 African Americans were newly registered.